Okay, then shall we start? I have been given for the next 2 hours 3 broad areas of international relations. That is, one, dealing with world politics. Second one, dealing with the United Nations organization and its charter and what they are able to do. And the third one on disarmament, that is mostly on the military issues. So what I thought was that I will really leave about 10 minutes halfway through for you to rest, to go to the toilet and so on. And maybe at the end of the lecture, give about 10 or 15 minutes for any questions that you may have to ask. But basically, I think the lecture is at any point, if what I am explaining something is not very clear, it is perfectly all right if you put your hand up and then even ask a question halfway through the lecture. That's perfectly all right. Also, I know that you have already had a full program that has covered something like 5 areas, mostly dealing with local domestic matters, and this is the one that is really dealing with on international relations. So I think you had a full program on engineering society at the domestic level, covering also some economic issues. Now I will cover basically the international affairs, which also affect our lives very deeply, and a lot of the matters that are affecting us are not traced. No one knows exactly what is happening, and for example, rise in prices, it may not be known as to what is really the cause for the price rise. Then also you have, for example, there are certain measures that are taken against Sri Lanka products. Now, for example, fisheries. Several times the European Union has put a ban on import of fisheries products into the European Union. Now there again, it's a long story as to why that happened, but basically these are all tied up with international affairs. So the 3 issues that, I think there are more people coming, I think. So the 3 issues that I will take up, I will start off really with the whole question of disarmament and military matters, because that's a fairly straightforward one, and then get into the whole question of the United Nations and all the international agencies that are there and how they affect us. And finally, I will get down to the whole question of the current world situation, because lots of changes have taken place and they are still changing place, and for us to understand that it's not very easy. So let me go back to the whole first question of disarmament, and also according to my program, there is also to discuss the world wars that have taken place. Now I will just quickly go through that. First of all, the whole question of disarmament, then after that international relations, and finally world politics that will cover the present situation. So if you go back to the early 19th century, that is the Dhanamivasya, it saw 2 world wars. It's very unusual, 2 world wars from 1914 to 1918, and then after that from 1939 to 1945. So 2 major world wars. And when you say world wars, they are not like a conflict that you have in Sri Lanka between Elahara and Butugamunu or between kings, but it involves a whole lot of aspects, not only the military, but also all those companies, everybody who's providing arms, all those things, and also through the recruitment of soldiers, usually by force. Now it is more voluntary, and even during the LTT time, there were no forced recruitment of the Sri Lanka army, but people volunteered and they joined in the army and so on. So under the British, both these world wars really took when we were under the British. ruled by the British, your colonies. And as somebody said, Suddha yata te okkama apita weda karanna une. Now this whole question of Suddha, that refers only to the color of his skin. Because at that time there were also people who were trying to make out that he has a much better, clear, pure, honest idea of what the world is. Because we were under the British and Britain was fighting on one side with different groups on either side. So that is another thing. And as you know also, the British legacy, what the British have left behind, is also very important. That is also the fact that I am talking here in English, because English is very widely spoken all over the world, and it was until recently the largest number of speakers were in English. But China is also now rising, because China is also very intelligent. It does not dismiss the British aspect of the language. They are also learning English very carefully, because that gives them access to more countries than if they were only pushing Chinese. So that way, the whole question of the British time, the language is one of the most important things that we have to know. Then the other thing, when it comes to the links, now even English promoted by the British has the international impact even in China. And India and China, with the largest population, connectivity between the two is mostly through the English language. Although now there are more people learning Chinese, and that will help them as well. In fact, in my case, I was for about 4 years ambassador in China, and I tried very hard to learn some Chinese, but it's an extremely difficult language to know, because the pronunciation is much more difficult than in English. Then I found that a lot of Chinese foreign service people and business people also spoke English. But when they spoke English, they had a particular accent. And I then started talking in English in that way. So they will say something like, good morning, how are you today? They break it into syllables, and even the Chinese embassy people here, they speak like that. So when we speak in English that way, at least you can get your views. So it's very interesting how people adapt. And I think it's very interesting, particularly for us to understand being a small island. And most important, we are in an extremely important location in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Then, of course, the Second World War took place from 1939 to 1945. And still, Sri Lanka was a British colony during that period also. And Sri Lankan army forces were also recruited under the British command, who were involved in the war. The Second World War was, of course, basically because of two philosophies of politics that were in some sort of dispute. That is communism versus democracy. And the results of the Second World War were many. The first point was that colonialism was slowly ending, because even the British, after the war, didn't have enough forces and enough power to keep working in countries like Sri Lanka. And for example, the tea estates, all those things, earlier, there was always a superintendent who was a British fellow who would supervise the whole thing. Then little by little, they found that they don't have the money to even to keep the bungalows which were built in these estate areas, which are huge, almost like palaces, and the staff and so on. So that quietly died down, and more Sinhalese, including my father, became estate superintendents and not British. But there again, the British system was to take people from where it was easy to take and where it was easy to control. So what they did was they picked a whole lot of people from Tamil Nadu, because they found that the Sinhalese were also somewhat too tough, and that they didn't take orders so quickly, and they didn't work like slaves. So there's a huge South Indian population that was brought into this country, and that is also some very interesting aspects on that. I will mention that later. Then the whole war was sort of ending, and little by little we gave way to the United Nations being set up in 1945. But still, the ideological divisions remained for some more time. This was called the Cold War. There was no heavy fighting, but the communist countries in 1955 established the Warsaw Pact. This included Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Bulgaria. They were continuing communism under the Soviet Union. But little by little, that was also breaking down. And here too, some interesting experience I had when I joined the Foreign Service. After about 1 year of getting trained in Sri Lanka, you are sent on your first posting as the third secretary. And I was sent at that time to the Federal Republic of Germany. Now it was very interesting because even at that time, that was about 1960s, one country was still broken into two, where you had West Germany as a Federal Republic of Germany following democracy. And on the other side, you have East Germany, which was a German Democratic Republic. And there was a big war between the two, where they were trying to control each other without allowing interference. And during that time, there was still a lot of suspicion between the communism and the so-called democracy. And I remember while I was in Bonn, I drove my Volkswagen after a lot of bargaining with a travel agent, where I got a permit to go into East Germany through the wall and so on. And I found that whenever I drove through that area, I was followed by a car. Mine was a Volkswagen. The German car at that time was called the Wartburg. And the same Wartburg was following me, my wife and I, and we went right round, looked at various places and so on. And I would find that this chap was always behind us, checking us out. And even in our room, when we came out in the morning, it was interesting, there were English-speaking housemaids polishing the floor, and they would ask me, oh, how are you? Where are you going today to see what? And so on. So that was probably passed on for this guy to come and follow us. So at that time, the suspicion was so strong that it took a long time before finally the wall was broken down and these two things linked up. I mentioned all this because this ideological thing is now fortunately breaking down, and this is not so bad. Then, of course, the number of treaties in the UN were also being sent up because they were also trying to avoid any clashes. Then, talking of the other aspects of disarmament, this whole question of non-proliferation and so on is being now used, and nuclear energy is now becoming much more used for peaceful purposes than as a means of arms. There is a non-proliferation treaty and so on being set up by the UN to try and stop the use of nuclear energy for war. And even the US is now having links with the Soviet Union and with China on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. That's a very interesting thing. And although there was a whole lot of necessary to look at areas, one of the big areas that Sri Lanka was concerned with, of course, is the Indian Ocean. And my boss, Mr. Shirley Amarasinghe, who happened to be before that Secretary to the Treasury, he was also able to start something called the Indian Ocean Peace Zone. That is to declare this whole Indian Ocean a place where warships should get permission before they enter it, and a whole lot of theory like that. But it was not followed for the simple reason that even the US did not want to sign the Indian Ocean agreements and join that. So that has now, it's still there in the UN. Every year they meet, but nothing really happens at that time. Then of course at this time, what was interesting is that when the UN started off in 1945, there were I forget the exact number of countries, but at the moment, I get on to the next point, looking at number 2, that is on the UN Charter, and the UNO was set up in 1945. That changed what was called the League of Nations, which was held in the First World War and so on. At the moment, there are 193 member states in the United Nations organization. That includes obviously us, all these countries are in there. And what is important is that the General Assembly is fairly effective now. It's a very large group, and it has several major areas. The first is, of course, the General Assembly itself, and that meets in New York, and that's a whole lot of, shall we say, issues have been taken up. And it is also interesting that the same man, Shirley Amar Singh, who was Secretary to the Treasury here in Sri Lanka, was also made president. He was elected president of the UN General Assembly for that year. So that was a major, shall we say, good thing for Sri Lanka, that he was accepted, even though it was a small country, because he had a very balanced view, not only on the Indian Ocean, but he also established the law of the sea. He started that entire aspect of the law of the sea, which is now stipulating particular rules how to conduct work in the Indian Ocean. It is not absolutely essential, but division of borders and so on are now much clearer. And even though they are divided, we still have problems now, for example, as to islands. Now, we had problems with the Kachadivu, with the Indians. Like that, there are so many other countries who have problems on the seas, and particularly China, who is now a big country. They are quietly pushing into what is called the South China Seas. Now, the South China Seas is an area which is bordered by most of the ASEAN countries, and they are trying to take that over, mostly for getting oil wells dug in that area, and that is one of the major international issues that is going on at the moment here in the UN, how to deal with these areas like the South China Seas. Then the UN has also two major committees. One is the Security Council. Now, the Security Council has 5 permanent members. Now, this is still the use of power, and that has not been broken down at all. And these countries are, of course, United States, United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France. Now, permanent members are for all time. Others are having a 3-year period, and then they hand over to somebody else. But this just to show that power is still held by these countries, and it is again done very much on this whole question of communism and non-communism, though it is not talked of. China and Russia are both communist countries, but their whole style of communism and their whole rule is completely different from each other, which I shall go on later. Then there are in the UN that are meeting right through, and also particularly during the General Assembly, where the resolutions and and various things are cleared in 6 different committees. The first one is, of course, disarmament and international security. Now, this one is very interesting, because the non-aligned also works very hard in disarmament, basically to reduce the strength of the white man because of his military strength. It's a threat. Even if they don't attack you, just because it has that thing, it's something like a threat. And the first one is called the disarmament and international security. That is, you're trying to control what weapons you are going to carry. And this, as I described to someone, it's සුද්දට සුද්දගේ ආයුධ අඩු කරන්න හදන්නේ. It's a very interesting thing, but it doesn't quite work because it's still having long discussions in the committees, but nothing happens. Then the second one is fairly important. I think it's the economic and financial one. That is, of course, again to see if that can be some spread of economic development and its benefits. And the next one, the third committee, is the social, humanitarian, cultural. That is a harmless one. They are discussing various social issues, cultural and so on. Then number 4 is not necessary now. It is the decolonization and special political issues. Now, most of the colonies today are given back to their own countries, and there are no colonies as such. Then 5 is the administrative and budgetary committee. That is all the money that is given by each member, and whatever that is there, each country depending on their GDP and strength, they are asked to pay a certain amount to the UN. So this is the one that is used for the UN to do all its work, including its aid and so on. But for things like aid, obviously the more rich countries do provide money for this aid to be given for education and so on. And the last one is the legal committee. So these 6 committees are the major ones that are really running the UN. That is disarmament, international security, economic and financial, decolonization, that's almost finishing now, administrative and budgets, and the legal one. Then there are also some other very interesting issues which countries like Sri Lanka have been suffering very badly. The Human Rights Council. Now that includes 47 members in the committee, but of course it is broken up according to countries, and every 3 years you have a new committee. So we have Asia and Africa. They have 13 members each. Eastern Europe has 6. Latin America has 8. West Europe has 7. And these are all having their meetings at different times. And our biggest diplomatic problem is this. Right now, this whole question of what happened during the war, the LTT's power is still there in the diaspora of Sri Lanka. If you look at places like Canada, United States, UK, there are large numbers of diaspora who are not all LTTers, but who find it convenient to keep on complaining that they cannot live in a country like Sri Lanka as they are Tamils. So that is their general line, and the Sudha is also quite interested in that, and they also use that against us. So this year we have been able to postpone taking up the Sri Lanka issue when the Human Rights Committee meets, I think, in a few weeks' time, but we have pushed this to September. So during that period, Foreign Ministry and particularly our Permanent Representative Office in UN have to do a lot to gather enough votes to stop any action being taken against Sri Lanka on because of the human rights issue. So that is one of the biggest problems that Sri Lanka has got, dealing with the diaspora. And I have met some of them, particularly in Canada. And the usual thing is that they say they cannot go back to Sri Lanka, that they might be killed, because during the LTT, certainly there was a lot of destruction both ways. So people lost their land, their houses, their businesses. They go there and said, if I go back to Sri Lanka, they'll kill me. And then they get their visa. At the same time, the Sudha is a very cunning, crafty person, but he resists. I've spoken to some of these Canadian people when I was in New York. You get a contract that you sign, say for 2 years, and your salary is so much. Then at the end of the 2 years, they ask you, okay, now do you want to continue staying? I can't give you an increment, same salary, but I can give you another one for 1 year. So most of them stay back, because what they get in Canadian dollars is fairly good, and some of them don't care anything at all about going back to Sri Lanka. It's just that they use that perhaps to help their families, their relations and so on, who may be still in Sri Lanka. So that diaspora issue is going to be, and continues to be, a very major issue for Sri Lanka to fight. It is the diaspora that is trying to get the human rights condemnation of Sri Lanka, because then they can stay longer in their own Western countries. particularly in Canada. It is the largest diaspora, and there are certain areas called Scarborough, which has unbelievably about 2 or 3 streets which are Indian and Sri Lankan small businesses. There are Thosekades, DVDs of Indian movies, even sometimes Tamil newspapers. They all do that, and those survive quite effectively in areas like that. Then, apart from the human rights problem, which is very difficult, we have also an International Court of Justice, but that is only when there is a huge international problem, particularly on things like borders and so on, which have to be put to this like a court to look after those issues. Then, of course, we have different groups and special rapporteurs who look at those countries, like even Sri Lanka has a special rapporteur who is the one who examines what is going on in Sri Lanka and brings it out at those meetings. So they have rapporteurs for slavery, terrorism, migrants, religion, and violence at workshops. Because that's another thing in some of the Western countries, some of the factories are usually the lower jobs are given to migrants who, because they need the money and would like to stay, they have this thing going on. So there are those aspects. The UN is a huge, shall we say, grouping which brings in all these things and makes it much more difficult for some other countries to actually even survive. Now that I've done those issues, let me then move on to the next one, which is really dealing with the whole question of the world politics today and the recent political changes in the world and superpowers and so on. So this is something that now affects us quite a lot. So what I thought was I can make this very brief and then leave it to you because you have only taken half an hour of our time. We can have a short sort of break sometime, and if there are any questions, we can take it either at that time, or if you have any questions on the parts that we have done now, certainly I'll be able to answer it now and then get on to looking at the details of the world changes, which is what is important, which is affecting Sri Lanka also particularly. So would you like to throw any questions on what has been said now? Or? No, then I shall get on to some of the recent political changes in the world, and is something that affects us most deeply. The section is described as world politics, recent political changes in the world, current and long-running conflicts, superpowers, colonialism. That's part of the current situation is that. And what I thought there is to concentrate a little bit more on Sri Lanka and our region, particularly the whole Indian Ocean region. One of our biggest assets is our location in the Indian Ocean, a small island, but almost in the center of the Indian Ocean region. And the Indian Ocean region today is the one that has the largest amount of movement of ships, of trade movements, all these things, because a lot of the countries like China and so on have a lot of their trade passing through this area. So there, what I thought was to look at very specifically Sri Lanka's relations with India, because that is something that we have to really work with, because they are next door, and also there is such a long history between the two countries that we need to be very careful about our relations with India. Then secondly, we have this problem because India and China, although they have reasonably good relations, they also see each other as competitors, and to that extent, a lot of our policies and what is happening in the Colombo port and so on are affected by how we are able to balance these two countries, which are very big but also very close. they are also close to each other, but at the same time, it's still not a sort of a, what you call this, absolutely peaceful situation. And this, even looking at the complicated, I'll look at first, I think, the India and China relations, because that is the bigger one. And when we look at the relations between India and China, there are a large number of aspects that need to be taken into account. Actually, many of these aspects also go beyond purely India-China relations. And the United States and other countries are also involved. And in fact, even Sri Lanka's own bilateral relations with China and India are related to this whole globalized issues that are rising. Sri Lanka is, of course, a very small country, but its location and its history of hundreds of years, both with China and India, are a major factor in the peace and development of all three countries. So these three countries are very important to see how that whole relationship can be worked out. Actually, the current formal diplomatic relations between China and India were established in April 1950. But the historic relations between the two countries on politics, on economics, culture, religious, extend at least 2000 years into the past. So it's a very interesting situation, and Sri Lanka as a little country is sometimes caught in between. Now, to look at it to contemporary times without going back too much into history, China is now the second largest economy after the United States. Now, this is interesting because although China is a communist republic, people always laugh at communism and say they can't do very much. China, about 2 years ago, was able to push back Japan. Japan was the second largest country in the world at that time. So China is number 2, Japan is number 3. And there are also rumors, which are, no one knows whether they are true or wrong, including by some people informally talking about this situation in the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, that China will sort of maybe even beat the United States and become the second largest economy in the world. So that is a huge issue that we are also getting entangled in now. And of course, India and China are both very cautious. Their diplomacy is quite effective, and they seek to have greater cooperation with each other. But of course, there are very sensitive issues like their border problems. So the border problems, though they occasionally break up, they don't really disturb the India-China relationship. Then of course, what is interesting for all of us is the famous Chinese Silk Route across the world that has been for centuries a major intercontinental economic link. Even when before communism came, that link between on the Silk Route was very important. It was called the Silk Route, and China's major exports, even in the 16th century and so on, were exports of silk and porcelain to Europe. And these are the very important issues even for the Europeans to have silk for the women. And of course, porcelain, all the plates and various things were made in China. And those two products were very, very extensive. And of course, there have been also Chinese sailors. Now, Cheng He, Chinese navigator, in the 15th century, he visited India as well as Sri Lanka, even before Christopher Columbus. Now, this is the interesting aspect. Some Western Australian academic, whom I used to know when I was serving in Canberra, he did his thesis and proved that even before Christopher Columbus went to the eastern part of the US, called the Discovery of America and so on, in the Santa Maria, China had gone there Cheng He had gone to the east coast even before him. Now there is a lot of dispute. The Suddhas are very unhappy when they hear this being mentioned. They always say, no, Christopher Columbus was the guy. And this Australian guy was very good. He had done some superb research into looking at and somehow tracing it. I don't know how it was done. Doing like models of the ships that were used, like the Santa Maria by Christopher Columbus, and bigger ships that are used by Cheng He. Now, Cheng He ships, I have seen a short documentary while I was in China where it was explained. They had, for example, two sets of sails, one like this and one like that. And they were able to control their movements so well by moving this down or putting this up and catching the wind much more than Christopher Columbus, who took much longer to go even short distances. So Cheng He's ships went very far, and I think even Sri Lanka he has come to Gaul several times. And there are of course some stories also in that was a time when there was no Mahinda Rajapaksa or Siripala or Ranil Wickramasinghe. There were the three kingdoms, the Jaffna kingdom, Kandy and Kotte. Now there he found that he was trying to do business mostly with Kotte because it was part that was very easy for him to travel across the Indian Ocean. And when those problems arose, he actually not kidnapped. He took one of the rulers from Kotte back to China for a few months until his problems in Sri Lanka were settled and brought him back. So he was such a cunning man that he was able to even come into a situation like this, because for him the Sri Lanka thing was very, very interesting and very important. So these are I say about the Sino-Indian relationship also. The whole question of China and Sri Lanka is coming in and it's very difficult to work out. And now we have got this Silk Route which we are pushing very hard. We are also helping in that. And because the China and India have two different economic systems, it's very difficult to see how you can balance this. But I can tell you there's a very good analysis of these two approaches in the Hindu newspaper of January 6th this year, 2015, where they compare the two systems, Chinese system and the Indian system, and how they are working that out. Now, China, of course, is a very globalized country now. It is not hiding itself into one small place. Now, when I was in Kathmandu as Secretary General of SAARC, the Chinese Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, who is now, of course, Foreign Minister, he visited me at the SAARC Secretariat in Kathmandu, Nepal, to see if China can establish a closer relationship with all the SAARC countries. Because he told me that if China is trying to only get close to Sri Lanka or something else, then it becomes a problem. So why can't he have a broad vision so that India and Pakistan won't see that China is going to help them and knock out the other fellow? So like that, to come as an observer in SAARC, and that worked. We were able to get it cleared, and so now China is also an observer in SAARC and one of the biggest contributors in a way to SAARC development projects and so on, in which they are getting close. Then of course, similarly, China is trying to have a slightly broader approach to all of South Asia, not merely as an observer in SAARC, and it has been assisting particularly Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka in the South Asian region, and Myanmar in the adjoining Southeast Asia area. Now what they have done is to help each of these countries at the same time gain very important ports across the whole Indian Ocean by having these things. So now, for example, China has a port in Gwadar in Pakistan. Then Hambantota in Sri Lanka was being built up, and later I'll speak on the Colombo port, that is a very controversial one. Then Chittagong in Bangladesh and Insein in Myanmar. So these linkages are extremely helpful for China. At the same time, they are also helpful to the countries concerned. Because now, for example, if there is a shipment coming of, say, mixed products, like say wristwatches, which are very small, then refrigerators, all these, and they are meant for stopover and leaving them in Myanmar, in Singapore, or any other East Asian countries, Sri Lanka and so on. So what they were looking at Hambantota was to have a large warehouse area where one ship coming from China could come all the way and dump some of these things there instead of having to stop at each point, which took time, costs and lot of waste. And then from there get smaller ships from those countries to take it to other ports. But that didn't quite work out right, because there was a lot of opposition from Western countries also on this. And there was a think tank, an academic group in the US called the Booz Hamilton Allen. It's very interesting that the three people who set it up, one man's name was Booz, B-O-O-Z-E. So one gets the feeling that he was drunk when he said that the whole thing is that this whole thing is really a device by China to act as a string of pearls or a string of thorns to hold back India. Because if you see the Western think tanks, when they have their displays on lectures and so on, they put this thing and then they show these points and say this is holding India like this, and that is one of the reasons why they have set up this whole linkages with these ports. But that is not quite true, because now what has happened is that these are all tremendous areas for development and movement of items, human beings and so on in this whole area. The Indian Ocean now is very big, and it has become, I think, one of the largest of the areas. And also when Chinese President Xi Jinping, he visited last year Sri Lanka, India, Maldives and some other small areas, he laughed at this whole question of this Booz Hamilton Allen, and he called Sri Lanka not a threat but a splendid pearl. Now Xi Jinping is another very interesting case for all of us, all our countries, and his visit to India was last year. It was the first time a Chinese president was visiting India after 8 years, and he achieved a great deal to discuss at a political level that India and China need not clash, that India and China can work together, and that was useful. And also they looked at Sri Lanka as a possible link for India and China also to cooperate. And there was very interesting the joint statements that were issued by the two presidents in September last year. I can give you these websites for you to go through them. It shows that the extent of cooperation in UN trade now exceeds the extent of dangers from the conflict. And it's very interesting that this is the president of the Chinese Republic, Xi Jinping. He even contributed an article to the Hindu newspaper in Madras, saying that China is the world's factory and that India is the world's back office to drive the Asian economy. So that linkages he was trying to push, and he's very human. He likes to come much more out into the open than the usual feeling we have about communist countries and so on. Then of course Narendra Modi in India, he was also a very interesting man, and he described the visit of the Chinese to India. He called it inch towards miles, INCH, angala, towards miles. And he explained this was India, IN, and CH, China. And miles, he said, was millennium of exceptional synergies, that these two countries had tremendous closeness, and that this was going to be one of the major powers in the world, signifying definitely that this is now the Asian century, and it's time that even the US and the Europeans quietly go down. And recently also I saw some articles in Chinese newspapers talking about the European Union and how Greece is having all these complications, and that China does not want to have linkages like that, but to select the items of connectivity or cooperation or whatever, and then develop on those. Then they went on to this thing is common for both things, and that was a very interesting area, looking at the question of China-India relations. And they have also established two very large industrial parks in India, one in Gujarat and one in Maharashtra, and they would endeavor, as I said, to realize an investment of $20 billion in India in the next 5 years. So the 7th China Financial Dialogue was held in New Delhi last year, and they approved in principle that even the Bank of China can open a branch in Mumbai. So these linkages are very strong, and they talk of not only the recent ones, and the whole way of promoting things like tourism, people-to-people bonds, youth exchanges, MOUs, exhibitions of Indian Buddhist art. All these things have been done, which has also bringing the people of the two countries much closer. And of course, the vital problem they have is still the exchange of views on the India-China boundary. That is still something that is not working out at all, but they are trying to work out some deals on that through better cooperation with their respective armies. Then, of course, the global issues which I was talking of, that is something which again the Chinese and India are looking to work out, and China has indicated, and I quote him, attaches great importance to India's status in international affairs as a large developing country, and understands and supports India's aspirations to play a greater role in the UN, including in the Security Council. Now that is interesting, because the Security Council is a highly elite sort of group. That is just the US, UK, Soviet Union, China, and just 5 countries. So for the first time, China is actually saying that India should also be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That means it has a veto. If any one of the 5 in the Security Council votes against a resolution, that doesn't go through. So this is a very sudden, but at the same time very quick offer of support between these two countries, and this goes on as very heavily on that. Now at that point, I think what I'll do is, we almost reach halfway, looking at also the question of Sri Lanka's general diplomacy in what is called the Asian century, that is the development of all these ports and of trade and various things like that. And the Asian Development Bank had described the so-called Asian century as one of shared global prosperity. Now this is a very important thing which the Asians are pushing, sharing it, not to make like the US being a top man and not dealing with the others on an equal level. So this is a purely sort of a propaganda type thing, and now they are looking at whether even China, whose biggest trading partners are actually the United States and the European Union. So they are bound in that, and there's no way in which we can get out of that. And we are also the ones that are going to get caught in it, because we are at the center of the Indian Ocean. And now that is the big area in which there will be prosperity, or maybe if there's going to be a third world war or something like that, this could be really the region for it. Because the US is now seeking what they call a pivot to the Indo-Pacific. They want to establish a greater presence in the India-Pacific area. That includes Sri Lanka as well. And our collaboration with China in Hambantota and all these things has led to a lot of speculation in the US security groups and academics who are always talking of this problem. And then of course we accept that although the Americans were trying to say that India and Sri Lanka are not friends, and keeping on saying it is the Indians who trained the LTT and almost divided Sri Lanka. But though this is said now, there are others who are now saying no, that is not true, because after some time, in 2009 when we defeated the LTT, Indian diplomatic guys in New York were very good. Mr. Paliyakkara, who is a colleague of mine, he is now the governor of the Jaffna province, which is very interesting, very good diplomat, and he was able to get 3 excellent UN documents adopted when the LTT was knocked out in 2009. That is at the Security Council, then the Human Rights Council, and a joint statement issued between the Secretary General of the UN, who came here, and our government. So now, despite all these aspects, there are these diaspora issues which I mentioned, which are complicating the whole, not so much the India-Sri Lanka relationship, but Sri Lanka's relationship. Maybe I can take some questions on that. Let's sort of separately on that. So then, that is in terms of the Sino-Indian relations and how they are sort of balancing it on that basis. Then now let me just take it in terms of a quick look through on the whole question of the relationships between, Sri Lanka and China's relations in the 21st century. Now here, the major, shall we say, propaganda or academic one they are using, of course, is this whole question of what they mean by the maritime Silk Route, which is the new main means of China extending its economic power and so on beyond into the outside world. But he has given this beautiful phrase of maritime Silk Route, talks of the history and various things like that. And what they called it the Silk Route, because earlier, as I told you, that was the main means of export and so on, which the Chinese had. And now Cheng He also, as I explained before, went through that. And the other aspect is also interesting in terms of the China-Sri Lanka relationship, and I think this has to be emphasized, that well before even Cheng He, there was Fashian, who was a Buddhist monk, who came in the 3rd century BC to Sri Lanka across the land route, across from India. That's the land route. And he spent 2 years at the Abhayagiri Vihara in Anuradhapura. And he copied down, he had supposed to have learnt Sinhalese, Pali, Sanskrit so fast that he copied a lot of these documents and history things. And he sent them back to China, which is now available there. And in his own area, the Chinese have set up a museum also, where they're showing this very important information center on the close relations between Sri Lanka and China on Buddhism, and also the fact that this was a very close relationship. Now with China's economic thing getting bigger, the relationship with Sri Lanka is also a very delicate one, which we have to manage well, because India may not be too happy about too close a relationship between China and Sri Lanka. India is also having this close link, so we want to make sure that that will not in any case be some chance for China to use Sri Lanka as a means of subverting or knocking down India. But that was, of course, very clearly explained that that China does not project the 21st century maritime Silk Route as a strategic, political or ideological promotion of the People's Republic of China and its power equation. They made that very clear that it is just a linkage. It is a political and cultural venture having significance for all states with mutual benefits to be shared among all. So that is, they are now very strongly pushed that line. And it's very interesting that I think I mentioned is that during my time as Secretary General of the SAARC, Wang Yi, who is now the Foreign Minister, he was then Deputy Minister, he had a long chat with me at the Secretariat on how he can get observer status for China, which he got, and now that is developing much stronger. Then, of course, we come into the other aspect, which is new aspects of Sri Lanka's own policies. Now, Sri Lanka has, of course, launched this 5-hub development strategy to benefit from its very good location in the Indian Ocean, and trying to say that they are trying to develop Sri Lanka as a maritime, aviation, commercial, energy and knowledge hub. That all these 5 areas, and I think the Chinese also helped us in working out this thing to this huge aspect of how Sri Lanka is helping not to have close relations with China to knock out India or anything like that, but to have a balancing impact and offer to be a link, a hub for maritime use, aviation, commercial, energy and knowledge hub. So these are being pushed, but they were pushed by Mahinda, but I think now in the current domestic situation, this is sort of downgraded, so I don't know how they are going to be work that out. And during my assignment as Sri Lanka ambassador in China, there were 2 presidential state visits to China, very, very close proximity. President at that time was Chandrika Bandaranayake in 2006, and there was a state visit that she paid. And then when the government changed, a friend of mine from the People's Liberation Army was asking how and what is this new president called Mahinda, what is his area of work and how good is he? And then I said, why don't you arrange a state visit? Now, the Chinese have visits in different levels. The state visit is the most important one. That is at the head of state level. The talks are at head of state level and many, many areas are covered. Then there is an official visit, which again could be a prime minister, but not necessarily that, just official talks going on like that. And then there's a working visit and other categories. But this state visit is unusual, and it is very unusual that China had 2 presidential state visits with Mahinda and with Chandrika and Mahinda within just 1 year, which is very unusual. So like that, at the same time, when the preparations for the 2007 visit, I was ambassador there, I inquired from the Chinese exactly what it would like as a sort of a official gift from the quote-unquote people of Sri Lanka to the people of China. And they came back again. Before the foreign ministry came back, it was the People's Liberation Army guys who come back, and they would like, they said, a Buddha statue to be placed at the Lingguan temple, which is very close to Beijing. And when they said Buddha statue, I was very happy about it, but then they said, no, we like a very large one. And he had got a book on Anuradhapura, which I had given to him long time back. He showed various pictures of that, and he pointed at this Buddha statue from Anuradhapura, a sedentary Buddha. And so Sri Lanka actually did do that. It delicately hand-carved Buddha statue on the same level and height. And of course, it was quite a big problem to put it into a plane, but they managed to send it up, and now it is being exhibited in a Buddhist temple called Lingguan Temple, very close to Beijing. So it also shows that the Chinese had despite being a communist country, they were pushing this whole concept of Buddhism and so on to bring that in. And even their problems are also like ours, ethnic and also religious. Their biggest political problems internally were in respect of Tibet, where the Dalai Lama was also trying to have a semi-independent state in Tibet, which lots of others within Tibet were anxious to make a separate state of Tibet. And that was also at that time supposed to have been pushed by the West. I'm not sure how far that worked out. So the Chinese are still wanting to push this line of their Buddhist origins also. So as I told you before, they had that first World Buddhist Congress, which we helped, which I, though I'm a Christian, helped by getting all the Chinese Buddhist countries in Beijing to help out by sending that. That a huge thing that worked out very well, and that really very is good. And of course, the other thing is, of course, in terms of their problems with Islam, this area called the Xinjiang state. Now there too, there are groups called the Uyghurs, who are a separatist movement, an Islamic group, separatist group, and they were also trying to break a small area of that area and make it independent. That of course goes on, they didn't really quite work it out. But certainly the world first Buddhist forum that was organized in Hangzhou in April 2006 with help from our mission in Beijing and with so many others coming, a total of 34 countries with some Buddhist aspects participated. And the theme of this was a harmonious world begins in the mind. So China was trying to push this line that if you want to have a united world, it should be on things like a harmonious mind, not necessarily talking of Buddhism, but of philosophy and all that, rather than large armies, large economies. Although in actual fact, China has both a very large army and a very large economy also in terms of it, because it is the biggest trade partner even of the United States. And there's a huge collection of US dollars in the Chinese treasuries. So all these things are there. The basic way of linking these things up. Sri Lanka has, of course, up to a point being involved in some of that, but they have always done it without trying to say that we have sort of fallen for them and they're trying to do that. And of course, the main theme that they have is the three evils, China's three evils: terrorism, separatism, and extremism. So they helped us quite a lot on this whole question of the LTT. And that was the major thing that helped us was the arms, because we were finding it difficult to get arms when the LTT was, because Indians did put pressure on various countries not to interfere in the Sri Lankan situation. But anyway, it was possible for him to sort of build these things, and that's the other aspect I think which was very important. The whole question of what the Chinese did in terms of help for Sri Lanka on the dealings with the LTT. Most of the arms were obtained from China at very good credit facilities and very rapidly brought across. And I used to have these long conversations with Gotabe, who would get very annoyed sometimes when there is delay in supply of arms. But the Chinese did all these things very fast, and they were able to send a lot of the arms, which all the other countries did not want to really get involved, because the Indian impact was still there on whether India should sort of be, shall we say, though it was the Indians were the ones who trained the first group of LTTers, and India cannot be blamed as wanting to have a separate state for Tamil Nadu, but one way of avoiding that was to help other groups of the Tamil groups, diaspora and so on, in a place like Sri Lanka, and trying to make Tamil Nadu state happy and accepting that without any anger against doing that. So it was a very subtle form of diplomacy by the Chinese, but I must say it really worked out quite well. And now these are really getting on to quite a good aspect. And I think just briefly, we got plenty of time. Can you have a more of question, take a short break and then come back for any question time. But even the last point I would like to make is on the visit of President Rajapaksa to China. That was in 2007. There were 8 agreements that were signed. 4 of them were on cultural and religious aspects, which is very interesting that they use that as a close projection of their close connectivity. And then they also involved a great deal in terms of urban development, including development of sacred areas. That's another interesting thing, Buddhism and so on. They're quite willing to help us on any old cities here in Coronado or Anuradhapura. Then they established a friendship city relationship between Guangzhou in China and Hambantota in Sri Lanka. Then cooperation between film industries and television channels. Then of course academic exchanges between University of Beijing and Kelaniya University in Sri Lanka. So those things went on very well, and even before that there are, of course, historically, under the early SLFP rule, the presentation by the Chinese of the entire Bandaranaga Memorial International Conference Hall, BMI Siege, which allowed us to host the 5th online summit in 1976. So from even that time, the Chinese felt that it's excellent means of providing this conference area for that conference, which also has been helping them. And it is now a major venue for not only conferences, but for cultural events, corporate engagements, education promotions, all that is there. And the other aspect of China's help was not all that wonderful. This is, of course, the Nelum Pokuna Theatre Complex. Now, this was opened in 2011, and it amounted to about $30 million for the whole thing. But somehow it has not been all that close, because I still remember discussing the building of that, and Chinese were looking at some of the books I had of Sri Lanka's different areas, and they saw the Nelum Pokuna, and they were thrilled with that shape and said they can give us a theatre in the same shape. And they agreed, but we also took a long time to agree to the various terms. And as a result, what we have there, the Nelum Pokota Mahinda Rajapaksa Theatre, as it's called, is that it has not been fully built in the way it was promised. In other words, you have those spokes like that going out, but they're all blank. Earlier, the idea was that that whole thing would include various parts of the building for the theatre, as well as for cultural benefits, a museum, and so on. But Chinese also little by little reversed on that. So we still have the whole theory and that shape, which is only those pillars that are going out, which should have been really covered up with some place. But that's one of the few things that I think that got delayed, and it didn't quite work out as we thought it would work out. Then, of course, now we have established some other aspects also, talking of things like Chinese Institute of Contemporary Relations, working with the Lakshman Kadirigama Center for International Relations. Now, there too, we have a problem in Sri Lanka, because at one point when the changes were coming, we removed the heads of each of those think tanks, and we just kept the thing running. Like, for example, the Kadirigama Center, Asanga was moved out. It still doesn't have a head as such. They have a same group that is working. So like that, some things that didn't quite work out were also just meaning. And for the whole question of dealing with the Chinese system, I think what is interesting is a good quotation from Mahinda Rajapaksa in March, when he also had not a state visit but another visit to China. And he said, and I quote, "Dealing with China is not just dealing with a country. It is an engagement with an entire civilization, including its religious, cultural, artistic, social, and economic stature." So that was a very interesting quote by him. The Chinese are very happy about that. And the linkage goes on, not as much as it did in the past, particularly in terms of the infrastructure and so on. China has played a major role. And there are so many other things, I won't go into anything else. So those are the two major aspects which I thought I will indicate in terms of what we have worked out with the Chinese and the civilizations and all these things like that. Now, the only other thing I thought was there is another summary which I worked out for the Kotalawada Defence University, basically on how all our countries, when they have relationships, how these things should be formed, and just made it in 11 points. What I can do is, it may be more useful for you to have it as a note, because it takes some time to go through the whole thing. And if you can if you want this type of thing, you can just pass a piece of paper around with your emails, then I can send this. We've got another 45 minutes time as well that we can do later. So what we can do is now, for example, I mentioned this question of how the colonies came up and how each state worked their border disputes. All that type of thing is rather interesting as a very short form of the evolution of what I would call the modern international system or the global strategic architecture, which is something which can survive without individuals trying to fight and do their trying to push their own countries. And right now, we may be having something coming up in terms of even the US and China. It's not very clear, but even Obama is very keen to keep that linkage because it is something that has been helpful. So let me stop at that moment and maybe take a few questions now for anything else that I do need to be cleared up on. Yeah, please. Sorry, which one? The
later stage of the war.
Yeah.
Through power, India was not supporting to Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
What was the reason for that?
No, it's also their own problem with Tamil Nadu itself. You see, the point is that they had, Manmohan Singh, for example, he did not even come for the Commonwealth Summit in Sri Lanka because he felt that that will make the Tamil community happy. Manmohan was nervous, but Modi is slightly different. His whole system is much more authentic, and his links with the US as well as with China has been very well balanced. And Modi is seen therefore as a sort of much more enterprising. And Manmohan was very good on the economic side, but on foreign policy and so on, he was not all that very good. And also he had this whole problem in Tamil Nadu itself with Jayalalitha also. Fortunately, it stopped for some time when she was not well and she's back again. But that was another aspect that we had to contend with India right through. How are we going to deal with Tamil Nadu, but at the same time deal with Sri Lanka? Now I remember at one lecture, that was in Delhi, I mentioned that M.G. Ramachandran, who was a great lover of Jayalalitha, was born in Sri Lanka. And there was immediately, hands went up, they were very angry. And they said, how dare you say that? But the actual facts are this, that his father was a Kangani in one of the tea estates of a slightly higher caste who was able to control the tea pluckers and the lower castes. And MGR was one of his sons, and I think he left Sri Lanka when he was only about 4 or 5 years of age. But the fact is that he was born in Sri Lanka. That was just a point I made. So when I explained that, little by little people calmed down, and they also did some research and found that it be accurate, that he was born in Sri Lanka, but that is purely a nominal thing. But right now, I think between Sri Lanka and India also there's a very careful and somewhat tricky balance. Now, one of the best examples was also in terms of this whole, more than in Hambantota, this whole idea also of setting up this whole place for warehouses and so on. And that was becoming quite a problem. So like that, all these issues, we have to be very careful with balancing this whole question of India and China. Because I still remember when I came back from Beijing, a friend of mine from India phoned me, a bit annoyed. And he said, what the hell, Nihal, are you up to? So I said, what? Because they at Hambantota, when you originally had that agreement with the Chinese, we had something like part of it, I don't have the text, but a part of the thing gave a 99-year lease to a fairly large area surrounding Hambantota. And that was open, and the Indians felt that that was really a ploy that we fell for, and the Chinese were going to set up a base against India in that point. So this was another rumor like that, but that obviously was quashed and that was all. And similarly on the Colombo port, that is another aspect that is working out, because the Chinese also were anxious to have another harbour point somewhere for not only stopping and passing on, but also to develop it as a tourist centre for them. Because at the moment, large number of Chinese are going through Sri Lanka and also to Africa and other countries. And the Chinese are the largest number of tourists coming into Sri Lanka, although there are more Indians coming, but they are not tourists. They are they got relatives here, they are partly involved in the businesses, things like that, so that's numbers are there. But Chinese are now the largest thing, and they are also, despite being a communist country, they are also very sentimental. For example, one of the lucky numbers in China is 8, bar, as they call it. Now, when we were arranging the first flights on Sri Lanka, when China was coming, South China flights were coming in here, and Sri Lanka got also flights into Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, 3 very interesting points also for tourists to use. And Chapkum, I was working on those agreements. He came and told me, we had a conversation that is within the Chinese, and said, we are going to give something very special. So I said, what? We are going to give your numbers coming into Sri Lanka, the luckiest number, which is which is 888. So the first Sri Lankan flight that was going in, I'm not sure it's to Shanghai or to wherever, was 888. And that also somehow helped the Chinese, because the Chinese also have a certain, despite the strength of communism, there is a sentimental thing on magic and various colors and favorable things, numbers, all that type of thing. They also have this numerology and so on, where they are, from your date of birth, they work out various horoscopes type things and so on. So that's a very interesting civilization to look at, because it combines both these things, and the fact that they are patiently moving now, whether they are going to become economy number 1 or not, it's of course open thing. But it's surprisingly some people, even in the Asian Development Bank, who have done it not necessarily for the bank itself, but privately, and they feel that the way dollars are being piled in the Chinese treasury, the US is also getting bound in a way with the Chinese, and that it should, within the next 30 years, become the strongest economy in the world. Chinese don't want to talk of that, because they feel that that is going to encourage more anger against them. So they just talk in terms of balancing and all the philosophic things that they have. So it's a very tricky situation as we stand. We are right in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and it's going to be a question of how we balance it out. Now, one problem we have is on this Colombo port. There again, now when government change and various things in the last few weeks or months, that whole project, which the Indians are not very happy about, development of the Colombo port, the whole thing was stopped. And various arguments they were looking at for environmental factors and various things. But it was again basically because finally Maitripala himself had to say, no, we are giving preference to India, not to China, in a roundabout way, balancing it off. Because the fear is that China is miles away, India is next door. And so it's a tricky situation for Sri Lanka now, because our foreign policy also is in a very, very difficult sort of situation. And I, for example, get questioned by the local diplomats as to what is going on. Whether is it Maitri, or is it Mahinda, or is it Ranil, or who is going to be the most powerful man, not necessarily Prime Minister or President or whatever it is, but how things are going to be worked out. So that is going to be very critical, and we have to wait till August 17th to see what happens. But the statements made even by the government are pretty bad on Colombo. They say, no, we have given it up, Others say, no, we have altered it. So it's, well, we also don't have a single spokesperson or minister or someone who can categorically say it. Fortunately, we have now got a spokesperson, a lady from the foreign ministry, who's a little more balanced, not tied up with either of the major parties or the major persons involved. And you will see also that a lot of the Americans are making fun of us. It's rather ugly, I think, where they have websites with very strange pictures of the leaders of Sri Lanka. Where, for example, there's one which is about 3-4 days, where Mahinda is putting in a woman's kit. Only his face is there. And Siripala is seen as a huge, tall man. And then Mahinda and even someone else is all, their sexes have been changed. And some people are like children. They are putting like in kids' clothes. So this type of thing, there's a lot of humor and things going on what is going to happen in Sri Lanka. So I think come August 17th, we'll have an idea of what it is. Fortunately, we have this girl who's a spokesperson for the foreign ministry. At least she keeps a balance in this situation, because people are asking whether who is going to be the big man. Whether it's going to be Mahinda coming back, or is it Maitri who's going to be the boss? Because now Maitri has taken and nominated Mahinda, but as now he says, I don't want him. So there are all these things which are happening day to day, which also makes it very difficult for us to work out how these things are going to be really worked out. But I think come what may, 17th will be a major day for us to see what's going to happen. The Chinese equation is also therefore a bit uncertain. And by saying that the Colombo port has stopped, other statements say, no, it is not stopped altogether. We are studying it further. So like that, those arguments are being spread out quite a lot. And that also makes it difficult for us to get the type of assistance to really build up on the economy and develop over the next few years, which we should be able to do. Because still, whatever is said, Sri Lanka has, if you look at the whole of South Asia, including India and all the other countries, we have the highest education rates. We have the highest per capita income. We are one of the few countries which has gender equivalent balance and equality compared to what India is. India is known as the rape capital of the world in terms of the horrible things that are happening to women there. Whereas Sri Lanka has hardly any of that sort of thing. So all those aspects, Sri Lanka is still having that record, and it's a question of maintaining it. It's because the country is small, we have been able to do it. But all that aspects are, I think, very important right now. And that's why I think this whole question of this whole Indian Ocean and how we are working with the Chinese, how the Indians are working with us, all that is a bit of a muddled state. But let's see how it works out in the next few days.
So could you please explain the process of the preparation of the agreements, especially the ones that are signed between different states?
Yeah.
Because you see that a lot of agreements are being signed.
Yeah.
When it is going to happen.
Yeah.
And most of the agreements are not being implemented.
Implement, that's right, yes.
Right? So, and there can be clashes like in the previous agreements that we have signed in other countries.
Yeah.
So who sent it, who maintains it, and what is the process?
I'm not involved in the foreign ministry now, though I was advisor to Mahinda some years ago. The thing is that these are all happening because I have called it, I told this to our foreign minister, that what Sri Lanka has is Kothuroti style. We are chopping things up too much. And too many things are linked, and there is no consistency in some of our economic policies. And so that is pity, because I don't think we will drop down in our economy. We still have the best figures in the whole of South Asia, even in terms of education, then gender relations, all that type of thing. There's no doubt at all. But we shouldn't somehow let them be controlled by one group, which is not liked by the other group. Not necessarily because the policy is bad or policy is good, but because they want to stop that. So that is a huge thing that even after when Mahinda was fighting against the LTT and so on, the UNP was not very happy with it, because the Norwegians were very unhappy. Because the Norwegians were trying to have a peace process, and also gain some economic benefits in Sri Lanka because of its location. Because of the Norwegians also, to go north, east, south and so on, Colombo would have been ideal. So like that, there are those aspects in our foreign policy also which are not talked about, but which have happened. So now it's very difficult to see how it goes, because even Maitripala is suddenly saying that he doesn't want Mahinda, though he nominated him. So, the whole thing gets upset, and we have just a little over a month now to see how things will work out.
I mean, in general, like say, in the countries, when there's a head of state visit, you see that a lot of economic trade agreements are inside. So, but I don't think about say 50% of those.
Yeah, that's true. They are not being.
And then there can be other like conflicts, like if you have signed an agreement with India, and you say that we have been sold already of running this trade or something, and then we can sign the same agreement with China and the same growth. So when you prepare an agreement to be signed with the head of states, who monitors whether these clashes are there, who does that?
Well, it's monitored by many ministries. Obviously, the legal guys are the ones who actually draft the thing out, and then Ministry of Economics, the Central Bank, all these people get involved in the economic stuff. So that way, even some of the agreements with China, as you say, not much has happened in them. But because China was very interested in getting a foothold in Sri Lanka, not only against India or anything, but just because it's perfect for their own movement of ships and various things like that. So they pushed it, and those aspects are okay. But now even the whole Colombo agreement on the port, that thing is now come to a standstill. And depending on who's pushing it most, guys say this meant employment for something like 200,000 people who are going to be involved in the port. There are others who suddenly say on the environmental factors, it is very dangerous because it might sort of block water coming in, at the tsunami coming in at that time would be even much worse than it was earlier. So like that, those things are coming. And for Sri Lanka at the moment, I think we are in a rather difficult point. Of course, the agreements that are signed also, they are just, now I can show you what the agreements are signed in China and so on. Now, some of those things are not even, they are just there. And it doesn't sort of, China has pushed the bigger ones like this port and then the theatre and BMACH, all those things they have done with consistency. But others are not all that sort of solid on their meetings. But even now, I find that the US links are fairly okay because some time ago, it was rather interesting that they don't have that document, unfortunately, because that some of the agreements that Mahinda had signed with the US also, that was some of those things didn't quite work out as such. It's, particularly about this Hambantota port, because that involves things like fueling, bunkering, warehouse storage, servicing of vehicles, all those things. The Chinese wanted because it's a useful port for them to pass through. But now those are not, none of those things have really sort of caught on.
What was the reason? Was that entry point where there is a storm or some person now about that? So the big ships cannot enter.
Various things like that, somebody signs something and they don't quite understand. The timing also is very short. When somebody is coming, you have about a month to prepare with the documents and agreements. You don't have time even for the foreign ministry to check with the actual ministries that are going to be in operation or who are going to help in developing it. So even now this whole question of Hambantota, even the idea was to have these huge warehouses, but now that thing is not really taking off. So this is real trouble that we have. We are what we call a realistic democracy in the sense that we have 10 ministers and 11 views. It is very difficult to get that thing in. And there is, even under our foreign minister, he is very anxious to have these linkages and so on. But still, it's very tricky, and I think this girl, what's her name, Maheshini, she has to, every Wednesday, explain various things to the public. And it's a very tough thing because, in fact, I also have advised her and the ministry not to make it a weekly one, because then even the minor points are being opened up And if you can't answer it, it can, as you say, reduce the confidence that some country has had by trying to have an agreement with you and say it's not working. So that whole thing gets upset on that basis. What I'll do is, if I got that list of anyone who wants any basic material, I can then also put in a very useful summary which I did for the Kotalawada Defence Academy on the main points about this whole question of the modern international system. They also want to like what you say, how are you going to work it between communism, non-communism, who are the guys who are going to determine whether this is what you're going to do or that is what you're going to do. It's that we have one of the largest cabinets in the world. Those are some of the records that we have. So whether who handles this, whether this belongs to this or that. And then of course there are these situations like the central bank governor right now. There was a huge noise against him to knock him out. But now he's happy. Everything is quietened down. So he's very, very tricky at the moment. Particularly on that, because lots of people are now pointing out that and saying it's crazy you have a central bank guy in such a position and you're not bothering anything about it. So it becomes quite tricky. And even for the foreign service to speak to people, and even some of the people who are being named as new ambassadors, it's I don't want to mention names and so on, but some people are totally incompetent for the particular work they're doing. It's always safer to have a professional guy. But otherwise, now even Delhi, again, the present ambassador, High Commissioner is getting extended further. It's a pity because Indian equation today is very, very important. We have to balance it out with them and the Chinese and so on. It's not merely non-alignment, but to really work that closely. In the old days, we had also officials who were very courageous, who could open their mouth and say something. And one of the best examples in which I got involved was that we were working on the whole question of these various meetings that we have, and I was helping Shirley Amarasinghe when we had the non-aligned summit here in Colombo. That was in 1976, 1976, and that went off well. And then when you have done that for 3 years, then you go to the UN also, you go as a chairman of the non-aligned movement, and that helps you tremendously for getting work done and so on. And then at the end of it, Mrs. Bandaranaike was chairing that meeting. Shirley was on the platform, and we had invited the army, the navy, hotels, all these people who had helped in the online summit, which we did with great difficulty but managed to do it very successfully. I myself, together with another friend of mine, I conked out, and both of us had to finally sleep on Mrs. Bandaranaike's bed upstairs in the BMICH because we were unconscious until we recovered. So it was a very tough time. So then Mrs. Bandaranaike told Shirley Amarasinghe, who was then the PR in New York, now in that 3 years in New York, you're chairman of the non-line, so you can bring up resolutions or that type of thing. And then she said, Shirley, I've got somebody lined up, I forget his name, someone from the Commerce Ministry. And then Shirley Amarasinghe, in this huge meeting, I was in the third or fourth row there, I said, no madam, I don't want it. Then she says, but Shirley, I have given his letter of appointment. Then he said, I remember the words, you can take it back. And then he said, I want that fellow, Nihal, where is that fellow? He's somewhere there. Because I was called the running dog of non-alignment during those, the non-aligned period, going from place to place with the document and getting some documents for the non-aligned co-sponsoring and so on. So he wanted it that place. That's how I was sent off to New York. And she was fast enough to accept that. After some time said, okay, I'll work it out. And took back his letter and then thought that it. So it's officials also now are not all that sort of open and courageous enough to. So let's see what is going to happen on 17th of August. That's the most important thing, I think. If you can reach some balance of several parties together, it's good. But that shouldn't make it too much of a kotroti type of thing by breaking it too much. Okay, what I'll do is I'll just, some of these other documents which I mentioned, if you have your emails, I'll send it on to you. And oh, that's a long list. Okay. So I'll leave it there. Any other questions or? There are also some very interesting things that Mr. Kotharawa Defence University is also doing. They're also having some think tank type of things, trying to work out what is required in terms of even the military type of assistance we should have and what we should get, depending on what the future is going to hold. I don't think the LTT is going to be a problem here, but there may be other aspects. The diaspora is also playing a rather tricky point outside. So that affects, for example, Canada's views of Sri Lanka are completely mixed up into what the diaspora is predicting there. Because they have done well, that the diaspora is now, some of them have sort of gone beyond being bricklayers and things like that. They have come up to staff levels as well. And there are also some businessmen there who are doing quite well. As I told you, in the Scarborough area of Ottawa, it's a huge area where they have many things of Tamil culture and so on, which they are promoting quite well. They are not antagonistic as such, but they are pushing that line that is a culture that we had. It has been now knocked out by Mahinda. And we must have some means of keeping our culture going at that sort of time. Okay, thanks for your attention. I hope I didn't